Well, good morning, and thanks for inviting me back to this summit. I spoke here when I was in opposition and just after I produced this little book on the economic crisis, but I've now got myself in a position where I'm got some responsibility for solving the problem that I wrote about in government. But just a couple of personal things about Warwick. First of all, you may not remember this, in fact you're probably born before all this happened, after this happened, that in the 1960s, Warwick was the anti-business university. There was a whole spate of new universities that were established, and the students of Warwick decided that it was completely inappropriate to have anything to do with business on the campus. So the business school was boycotted, and revolutionary activity was mobilized to stop this terrible invasion of academic freedom. Anyway, I think things have changed a bit, and I've now come here as Secretary of State for Business, amongst other things, recognizing that this is not alien on this particular campus. The other personal note is that we're in something called the Ramphal building. I don't know whether many of you know the origins of this, but Sir Sonny Ramphal used to be Secretary General of the Commonwealth. I used to work for him, and he introduced me to some of the more interesting problems of development economics, and also to helping to produce with him and the Prime Minister of Norway at the time the first intergovernmental report on climate change. This was over 25 years ago. So he was a major pioneer of thinking about some of the big long-term problems of our age, and I'm personally indebted to him because he involved me in that. Well, later this morning you're going to get a talk from a proper economist, Sir David Henry, who's here in the front row. I used to be, or used to claim to be, an economist. At least I studied it and taught it for a while, but I defected to become a politician. And the problem which interests me, and which I'm going to talk about, is the relationship between economics and policy, seen through my eyes as a politician. And I think a good starting point is the adage that's often attributed to Keynes, that all practical men of affairs are slaves of some defunct economist. In other words, many of the ideas that permeate the public debate often originate in economic thought, but somewhat far removed from the action. I mean, if you listen to some of the political commentary in the UK about our economic problems, you'll have one group of people saying, well, the problem is we're not spending enough, government isn't spending enough, the deficit isn't big enough, or the government is reducing the deficit too quickly. And I suppose in a very indirect way, this goes back to Keynes. I'm not sure Keynes would recognize many of the arguments that are advanced in his name, but there is a strand of thinking, which is a powerful one, which has that genesis, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And there's another strand of thinking which often comes through in a very crude way, and it says that all our problems are caused by too much regulation, and it's this dreadful people in the European Commission who are producing demands for straight bananas and square tomatoes, and too many regulations governing labour, and we should introduce rules so that people can be fired freely, and that the regulatory system is too preoccupied with protecting newts and nightingales and things of this kind. So all we need to do is to get rid of all this regulatory stuff, and the economy will start growing again. And, well, actually, you could trace that back ultimately to what's sometimes called the Austrian School of Economics and Hayek and people of that kind. And again, they have an important role in thinking about this crisis. But the central point I want to start with is that however much we try to distance ourselves from it, economic thinking has a very important role to play in framing the political debate. Now, the particular issue I want to focus on, and this may be a disappointment from those of you who come from overseas and want a big global picture, is I want to focus on the UK, that's what I have some responsibility for, and trying to explain what's happening, how we get out of this particular set of problems we have, which can be defined in the following way. That we've had a very, very profound economic crisis. Output is no higher than it was at the peak of the crisis in late 2008. Living standards, which you may have seen from the figures a few days ago, real wages, are probably now no higher than they were a decade ago. The current outlook is one of flat production, some people would say worse. How did we get into this position? I mean, of course, it isn't all negative. I mean, there are some rather strange things happening in the UK economy which are positive. I mean, the last 2 years, something of the order of 1 million private sector jobs have been created. Unemployment is falling, employment is rising. It doesn't fit with our normal characterization of an economic slump. Similarly, there has been an enormous upsurge in entrepreneurial activity in the UK. Within the last couple of years, the number of people engaged in self-employment or entrepreneurial activities has grown from 6 to 9%. I think there are record levels of new companies being formed. So there's some very strange counterintuitive things happening in this era of crisis. But let me go back to the basic question about how did we get into this difficult situation in the first place. As I tried to write a book about it, one of the things that struck me was that when I was doing it, was that there were very few historical bearings that we could find which helped to explain why we are where we are. And you have to go right back in time to things like the South Sea bubble. And the economic writer that I felt best captured the position we have today was actually in the early 19th century, John Stuart Mill, trying to write about a sequence of banking collapses which occurred in the latter part of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And he described how in the aftermath of a banking crisis there is a sudden, as he put it, a sudden stop on credit. And this in turn creating a period of depression. This is a very different world. Governments intervened in the UK and elsewhere to stop this crisis getting out of control. But that was the nature of the problem rather than anything which has happened in modern times. We're dealing with the aftermath of a banking crisis. Now, there have been such activities in modern times. Those of you who've come from East Asia will be familiar with the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, had devastating impacts for a period of time in countries like Korea and Indonesia, but they did recover quite soon. We had a banking crisis in Scandinavia about 20 years ago. That was scarcely registered on the kind of Richter scale of economic activity, but it was quite profound in those countries. One of the bits of evidence that we have which help us to understand what's happening is some cross-sectional work by Rogoff and Reinhardt. You may well be familiar with the article, which looks at modern financial crises and they're linked to economic growth. And it does establish a very clear pattern, and the pattern is one of very slow recovery. And what's happening in the UK does fit that story. But what can we learn from economic thinkers? I think one of the slightly irreverent observations I would make is that a generation of students were taught something called the efficient markets hypothesis about financial markets being essentially rational. And I think we can now say that this was not very helpful. A lot of people, not a lot, some people got Nobel Prizes for the equivalent of saying that the sun goes around the earth. We now know that's not how financial markets work. But there were people who had insights which were actually more relevant. A writer that I don't think entered many economic faculty syllabuses was somebody called Hyman Minsky. I don't know whether he's taught at Warwick. But he, some decades ago, described a sequence of events in financial markets where you start with high levels of leverage. People start borrowing, probably because interest rates are unnaturally low. They then start taking more risks and getting very high returns on equity on the basis of that leverage. And they then get carried away and they starting speculating heavily, and then, as he put it, greed and folly take over, and you get a bubble, an asset bubble. And then when you get to the top of the asset bubble, you get panic. And panic is involved in a large amount of distressed selling, the collapse of financial institutions. And then subsequently, there is, in his words, a revulsion from credit, resulting in serious economic contraction. And he describes that wave of essentially irrational activity that has driven some financial markets. And you could recognize the Minsky story in what happened in this country with the big asset bubble that built up in property, both domestic and commercial. Same thing happened in the United States, and which led, again in his words, to panic in the latter months of 2008, and then the period of revulsion, which we're still living with today. But overlaying that, there are other problems too. I've often found it useful to go back to a man who wrote a century ago, called Irving Fisher, about something called debt deflation, where you get a large accumulation of debt in households, could be in companies, but particularly in households. And then when that happens, you can get into a vicious circle where consumers spend more and more, withdrawing demand from markets, and you get into a downward spiral of economic activity. And that has some of the features which we can see today in very low confidence in amongst consumers and in the company markets. So those are some of the strands of economic ideas which we should be perhaps trying to draw on and having a picture of this crisis which goes beyond the simple theories which we've been taught in the past. But I just want to move on to ask the question which I ask as a policymaker, which is, given where we are, what do we do about it? How do we get economic growth moving against this background? And I think the debate often becomes very confused because there's a distinction which we need to make between the short term and the long term, because these are themselves rather elastic idea, but in the short term we have a shortfall of economic activity below capacity, below trend. The question is how you deal with that problem, macroeconomics. There's also a longer term issue about how you generate sustainable growth in the long sustainable growth. There was a very good report a couple of weeks ago by the London School of Economics, some of the professors there, which identified long-term growth as being essentially driven by skills, human capital, and by innovation. And if we're looking to put the UK economy and other Western economies on a good path for sustainable growth, those are the things we should be thinking about. And in my job in government, I'm putting a lot of thought and effort into creating something which we call the industrial strategy, which is actually creating the foundations for a knowledge economy based on skills and on innovation through science. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the shorter term problem about how we get the economy moving. And I think it's useful there to go back to the caricature debate that I started with about the Keynesian criticism of government. Because the criticism of government, loosely from the left, though this often doesn't fit the political stereotypes, the criticism comes of three elements, essentially. The first is that Britain has a problem of aggregate demand, lack of aggregate demand, as Keynes would have argued in the context that he wrote in the 30s. Secondly, that attempts to deal with this through monetary policy are failing and are doomed to failure. And the third is that by cutting its deficit, well, this is sometimes called austerity, not quite the same thing, but by pursuing fiscal contraction, the government is adding to the problems of economic recovery. These are the three strands of the argument, and I want to deal with each of them in turn. First of all, does Britain suffer from a lack of aggregate demand? Well, the evidence is put out that there is an output gap, and it's something very difficult to measure, but there is a fair degree of evidence to suggest that a lot of the economy is producing at significantly below potential. But that begs a lot of questions. I mean, why do we say that there is a shortage of demand? The original Keynesian model was essentially assumed that we were talking about one country. But actually we're not. We're operating in a highly integrated global economy. And in 2009, we had an approximation to the problems that Keynes wrote about, because the whole world was in a crisis and there was a threat of deflation throughout the world economy. And in 2009, you had a coordinated response by the G7 countries plus China. All countries systematically tried to stimulate their economy through deficit financing, and it prevented, quite successfully, a descent into the kind of crisis we experienced in the 1930s. But today, the position is very different. I mean, world trade is growing rapidly. I mean, it grew 14% in 2010, 5% in 2011, and 3 or 4% last year. So world trade has been growing. I mean, in that sense, Britain, which has a 3% or something of that order of world GDP, doesn't have an aggregate demand problem. There's plenty of growing demand out there. Moreover, the other problem which Keynes wrote about in the 30s, which was the gold standard problem, Britain having an overvalued exchange rate, so it couldn't compete in this world market, is not true either, because as a consequence of the crisis in 2008-9, Britain devalued its currency by 20% trade-weighted basis. So we have, in price terms, a relatively competitive exchange rate. We have rapidly growing world markets. So it doesn't quite make sense to talk about a shortage of aggregate demand, because there is aggregate demand out there. Now, of course, you may think that's a bit abstract, because if you're a shelf stacker in Blockbuster and you've just lost your jobs, you can't just walk across to Jaguar Land Rover and ask for a job exporting cars to China. It's not quite as simple as that. But nonetheless, in a crude sense, it doesn't actually make sense to talk about shortage of aggregate demand. There are demand problems in some sectors, and the construction industry is perhaps the most extreme example of that. A lot of unemployed resources in construction and lack of demand for housing and infrastructure to supply that demand. But across the board, the simple Keynesian mantra of lack of aggregate demand doesn't quite fit. There's another sense in which the crude Keynesian argument doesn't work here either, because there are some obvious supply-side problems. I mean, some of them are in areas of deficiency of skills. In the UK, for example, we have an absolutely chronic shortage of engineers, so even if the demand were there in parts of the traded sector like manufacturing, it would be very difficult to meet it, which would mean either that imports would come in or it would be reflected in domestic inflation to some degree. But a more serious problem is that because of the collapse of the banking system, there isn't an effective transmission mechanism which is to convert demand into supply. So we're not dealing with a pure example or even a real approximation to a conventional Keynesian model in terms of aggregate demand. Let me deal with the second criticism, which is that an attempt to support the economy through monetary policy can't work. Now, those of you who've done your macroeconomics will be familiar with the Keynesian criticism of monetary policy in the 1930s. And let me just go over that in the present context. Because what's happened in the UK, and it's also happened in the United States and elsewhere, is that an attempt has been made to support demand not through running larger and larger fiscal deficits, and we're currently trying to contract them, but by having a very expansive monetary policy. And what has happened in the UK is that official interest rates are close to zero, and if you take into account inflation, they're actually negative. And quantitative easing is being used, very complex process. I'm not entirely sure of the mechanism, but essentially we're expanding money supply directly. And one of the effects of that is to drive down long-term interest rates, which are also negative in real terms. So a very active monetary policy is being used by the central bank. And we have this combination at the moment of an attempt to contract the budget to deal with the deficit problem, which I'll describe a bit more in a minute, alongside an expansionary approach to money. One of the consequences of that very expansionary approach to money is the devaluation that I described a minute ago. Now, is that right? Is the Keynesian criticism of it right? Well, I think the Keynesian critics of monetary policy would argue, from the basis of the original theory, that there are serious problems around what we call the lower bound, that you can't have interest rates which are low enough to bring investment and savings together again. That was the problem in the 1930s. And it was compounded by the fact that Keynes was writing in a period of falling prices, deflation, which meant that you could have zero interest rates, but positive real interest rates. That's not a problem we have at the moment. It's a very, very different kind of issue. The reason why monetary policy is proving difficult to operate at the moment is for very different reasons. We're living with the aftermath of a banking crisis and collapsed banks, so that you have an official interest rate which is zero or negative in real terms, but the interest rate which is faced by many borrowers, small businesses, the real drivers of the economy, is actually very high, because banks are trying to rebuild their balance sheet by having very fat margins, and this is making the cost of capital for business very high. So that's why monetary policy is difficult to operate, though not for the reason that the Keynesians would argue. The other problem here are with the unintended consequences of an expansionary monetary policy. What is happening at the present, partly as a result of quantitative easing, is that you are getting inflation in asset markets. The London property market is getting completely out of control at the top end, and at least in part this is because of the way that credit is being pushed through the system through QE. So you're getting unintended consequences. You're getting a long period of very low official interest rates, so that pension funds that are investing in government gilts are finding they're giving very, very low returns on their annuities. And this is affecting savings behaviour in the long term in very unpredictable and possibly rather unhelpful ways. So that monetary policy is having problems. Some people would say it's run its course, but they're not quite the problems that the Keynesians would argue. Now, where we are with this debate is that some people are arguing, I have a lot of sympathy with this, people like Adam Posen, who was a departing member of the Monetary Policy Committee, that what we need is a more creative approach to monetary policy. And that what the central bank should be doing is that instead of buying up government gilts, it should be buying up bundles of small, medium-sized company loans in order to get credit moving at the same time, or possibly investing in infrastructure. Now, the problem with that is that it would involve the central bank, the Bank of England, acquiring risky assets on its balance sheet. And there's a somewhat arcane debate going on at the moment between the governor of the Bank of England and the policy community about whether the central bank should be taking risks in that way, or whether that's the responsibility of government. And I think many people are looking forward to the advent of the new Canadian governor of possibly injecting some creativity into this currently log-jammed discussion. But let me deal with the third criticism, which is that the government that I'm part of, through its deficit reduction programme, is actually making the problem worse. I mean, the argument that rages across the House of Commons is that all you government ministers, you're cutting the deficit, and this is taking demand out of the economy, and this is what's responsible for the low growth, and you should be reversing that. Well, let me try to address that problem. Now, in part, this is an empirical question. You know, how much has deficit reduction actually influenced the economy? And the truth is, it hasn't very much. The disaggregated work, looking back over the last 2 years, has tended to suggest that the reason why the economy has stagnated, and indeed why demand has come out of the economy, is not actually because of the government's spending cuts, which haven't amounted so far to very much, but partly because of high commodity prices, as a consequence of rapid growth in Asia, bidding up the price of oil and other commodities, and that we have been in the UK on the receiving end of adverse terms of trade, and this has in turn affected real wages, and that has in turn affected demand. We've also had a problem on exports in the Eurozone as a result of that crisis affecting our growth. So if you simply do a bit of growth accounting and look at what are the factors which caused the British economy to slow down over the last 2 years, the government's deficit reduction was not actually a particularly important part of it, though it may have played some role. But then the next point is, well, you know, does the government actually have any choice? I'm presiding over a department at the moment where we're having to make 25% cuts over a 4-year period. Now, it's not pleasant. Not doing it out of fun, I can assure you. We're doing it because there is a serious problem. And the serious problem is the fact that as a consequence of the crisis, the government acquired a very, very large structural deficit. One way, I think, analogy that may be helpful in explaining this is a little bit what the problem of a developing country, that if you're in a developing economy that depends on commodity exports, oil or coffee or something of that kind, and that major export declines and takes with it a larger part of your revenue, then you have a structural problem. And the UK, in many ways, resembles a developing country. We have 2 big exports, which are commodities, one of which is oil, which has been declining for geological reasons, and the other of which is banking, that collapsed and took with it a large amount of government revenue, and indeed revenue also from the housing bubble that was associated with the banking expansion. So we lost a large chunk of government revenue. And any government would have to deal with the structural consequences of that. And we took the view that the government couldn't continue to borrow 9% of GDP in international capital markets indefinitely, and that unless the government had a serious plan to reduce that deficit, we would face a loss of confidence, higher long-term interest rates, impact on the exchange rate beyond our control. And indeed, you could argue we've been fairly successful in stabilizing the situation and building confidence as a consequence of that. So the argument that the government has aggravated the problem through some kind of masochistic wish to cut the deficit when it didn't need to, I don't think has foundations. So I hope, albeit very briefly, I've dealt with what I would regard as the 3 central, quote, Keynesian criticisms of the way that the economy is being managed. But let me, in conclusion, come to the question is, well, what do you do? Do you just sit here and, let things bounce along the bottom? Does government have any discretion? Is it limited simply to waiting for this rather clever Canadian to come across to the country and get the economy moving? Do we spend the next 10 years engaging in little supply-side tweaks that might conceivably make the economy more efficient? Or is there anything that can be done? Well, I think here the debate is narrowing to one area of policy which is government capital spending or government investment, because that's in a somewhat different category from other forms of government spending. When we talk about reducing the deficit, we're talking about reducing the gap between government's tax revenue and the money that goes out of government through current spending by government departments or welfare spending or interest for that matter. But there is a separate category of government spending where the government actually invests. And one of the consequences of the economic crisis was that in 2009, the then government slashed, rather brutally, government capital. It was halved, effectively. And we've seen the consequences of that in terms of the impact on the construction industry. It's not the sole reason. The British construction industry is in trouble partly because of the big slowdown in house building as a consequence of the bursting of the housing bubble, partly because of the bursting of the bubble in commercial property. But a significant factor was that the government cut capital spending. I think we can now say that was a mistake. Didn't need to happen. It's done quite a lot of damage. And this government, starting in the autumn statement last year, has tried to rebuild government capital investment, but so far on quite a modest scale. And critics of the government, or indeed friends of the government, might well say, well, why don't you go much further? Why don't you take that logic further on? Government could do lots of things. It could, encourage councils to build houses. It could build lots of roads and railways and utilities, and it could borrow money at very low interest from international markets. So why don't you get on with it? And I think that is actually the question that is now being debated in the policy community. Probably it isn't a simple answer to that. There is a risk, of course, that if the government departs from what is perceived to be strict discipline, not just over the deficit, but over all forms of government borrowing, that you then lose confidence and you have those negative consequences. And that risk has to be set aside, the risks of the economy continuing to grow slowly and losing the confidence of markets in that way. There is a balance of risks, and I don't know where that balance of risks ideally lies. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you, because the budget's to come up in a few weeks' time, and our negotiations with the Treasury, and I can't preempt that, and I certainly shouldn't. But that seems to me the main area of policy where there is a serious debate to be had about the pros and cons of different ways forward. So that's all I want to say. Perhaps just leave you with the thought I started with, which is the practical men of affairs grappling with economics. And what I feel coming out of this, and as somebody who is dealing with politics 99% of my time and occasionally trying to remember some economics for the remaining 1% of the time, is that economics has a lot to teach us, but that most of the schools of economics that we grew up with are either irrelevant or at best only partly relevant to the crisis we've just lived through. We have to draw on a whole set of streams of thinking. Now, there is the role of Keynes, and because we have got a demand problem to some degree. There is Friedman, the active use of monetary policy. We've got the thinking around debt deflation. We've got Minsky and the bubble and the asset bubble and the theories around that. We've got to somehow create, in my view, an eclectic explanation of why we're in this crisis and of the policy levers that actually work in pulling us out of it. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer questions.
Okay, so we have around 15 minutes for questions. Would you just put your hands up? Yeah, so we've got a question right here in the middle, if we can get a microphone.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. And I have a question. You touched briefly on the importance of innovation and the UK's lack of skilled engineers. And do you actually perceive that to be a problem of the incentive structure, with a lot of the brightest minds actually moving into the service industry because of the very high wages being paid and not going into research, engineering or development?
Good question. I think several answers to that. I think first of all, the shortage of engineers, or that's a pretty wide category, but is an international problem. It isn't just a UK problem. I think most Western countries, including Germany, I suspect, and certainly many of the rapidly growing countries in the Far East, have a chronic shortage of the same people. But I think it is particularly acute in the UK. And one of the contributory factors is that some good engineering graduates disappeared into financial institutions. You had a group of people who were called quants, very good mathematical brains, actually some of them engineers, who went into investment banks, confecting many of the very complex products which lay behind the panic and collapse of confidence in the banking system. It's done a great deal of harm. So if we're trying to build up an engineering pipeline in the UK, it's a long and complex process, but I'm trying in government to get the foundations in place with my colleagues. It's partly persuading young people at school, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, that this is a good career. And I think we're beginning to see the signs of that. It's then making sure that by the time they've got to A-level, they've got sophisticated maths. That's true of economics as well, but engineers you can't be an engineer or a physicist unless you've got good maths, and that probably means further maths. Then recruiting them into universities. And that is actually happening. I know there's a lot of controversy around student fees and all that, but one of the things which happened this year is that demand for engineering in universities is more buoyant than in any other subject, because young people are now looking at returns from their degrees. And then when they've gone through university, making sure that they then go into manufacturing rather than into financial services. So it's a long pipeline, and I think we're addressing it at each stage along that pipeline. Of course, there are non-graduate engineering skills which are also equally required, and that's why one of the reasons why, despite the scarcity of resources in my department, I've insisted that we put more resources into apprenticeships, and we're beginning to get advanced apprenticeships producing more skilled craftsmen, but it's a slow process.
Okay, I think we've got some questions from Twitter if you want to take those quickly.
Hi, I have a question over Twitter from David Blanchflower. He'd like to give you his regards and ask how to get lending moving to SMEs and why efforts have failed so far.
Well, David Blanchflower is often sort of characterised as the leading Keynesian critic of the government, and he is actually quite a subtle intelligence, and he has quite rightly drawn attention to one of the big blockages in the economy, which is the fact that the money transmission mechanism doesn't work properly, and because the banking system isn't converting savings into loans to productive enterprise, particularly SMEs. Now, a whole variety of initiatives have been taken to try and deal with this problem. The government offers guarantees for tail risk. If companies have inadequate security, the government will try to cover some of that. We have tried setting up specialist institutions, and I'm in the process of trying to establish a business bank, which will hopefully create a pool of liquidity that can go into some of the defective markets for small-scale companies. We're encouraging the creation of new banks, which will lend to business. We've got some very good ones like Handelsbanken, the Swedish bank, which is now operating on an increasing scale, and Metro and Aldermore, Shawbrook and others, but they're small scale at the moment. But the truth is that the banks are decreasing, not increasing, the supply of capital to small, medium-sized companies. Net flows are declining, and this partly reflects the lack of confidence amongst companies themselves, which are sitting on cash, But it also reflects conservatism by the banks, which have lurched from extreme recklessness before the crisis to extreme conservatism now. And we haven't yet solved the problem. We've got initiatives and we will produce more, but there is a problem, which, as you quite rightly say, and as David Blanchflower rightly says, is as yet unresolved.
Okay. Do you want to take this question, Lucia?
Do you believe, like your party leader Nick Clegg, that the referendum and years of uncertainty up to the referendum on our position in Europe will have a damaging effect on jobs and growth, especially in light of the fact that European leaders have come out and said that we can't do Europe à la carte?
Well, I did actually make a substantial speech a few days before the Prime Minister that wasn't terribly well received in that quarter. Did warning of the uncertainties that this was creating, and partly because I have a role in government of trying to attract inward investment from Japan and India and China and the United States and elsewhere, and the problem of trying to explain to them why Britain is generating this additional level of uncertainty on top of all the others. But having had that speech and now knowing what the position of our coalition partners is, I think the problem is much less serious than it could have been, much less serious, for several reasons. First of all parties are now agreed, three-party leaders, anyway, I'm not talking about UKIP, three-party leaders are agreed that it's desirable that Britain stays within the European Union and the single market, and we will campaign for a yes if there's a referendum. Secondly, we're all agreed that the European Union needs to be reformed. A lot of things wrong with it, a lot of bureaucracy around the regulations of the single market and much else, and that if we work together with other European countries, we can achieve results. So we all agreed on the need for reform. And thirdly, we're all agreed on the fact that a referendum under certain conditions is right. And actually, although this rather got lost in the exchanges a few weeks ago, Parliament has already set out the terms under which a referendum could happen. If there are changes in our treaty arrangements with the European Union, then we would have a referendum. And we've got to engage in that. And people like me who are in favour of Britain remaining in the Union have got to be able to argue that case publicly. You can't hide from the public. And I think in any event, the Eurozone crisis is going to produce closer integration in the Eurozone countries, around tax issues, around banking union, other things. And that will of itself create the need for treaty change and a referendum. And we've just got to face that. Now, the point I make to the business community, and they're always asking me that question, the one you've put, is say, well, yeah, there are risks here. But people in business are dealing with risk. That's what they do. And the question is, you have to quantify that risk. What is the risk of Britain leaving the European Union and the single market? Well, 2%, 5% at most. I mean, you know, compared with all the other risks that business runs, this is a pretty minor risk. And I tell them not to worry about it.
Okay, let's take a question from the sides. Yeah, just around the front here.
I was just wondering if you could take your politician's hat off, or perhaps if you could imagine how if you had carried on as an economist, if you would be quite as obsessed with economic growth. And I mean, if you asked your old mentor, Ramphal, then, or you described your problem now, or if you described it to those students in Warwick 30 years ago, and you said, look, we've got this economy, and it's sort of gone sideways for a few years, and they'd say, yeah, but it's still, 100% larger economy than we had. Your standard of living is so much greater. Ramphal might have said, yes, but Vince, your economy is okay. What about the rest of the world? Don't you think we, in the UK, or in the developed world anyway, get very obsessed with growth, economic growth, rather than thinking maybe the world economy has already grown enough?
No, I don't agree with that, and I don't think that was Sonny Ramphal's argument either. I mean, he was more concerned about ensuring that there was a growth in economies and in living standards in poor countries. That was his major preoccupation, and rightly so. But it's happening. I mean, even in the most troubled countries of Africa, you're now getting very considerable economic dynamism. And I just, a few weeks ago, came from Nigeria, right, which in many ways an emblem of a lot of the problems of African development. But in western Nigeria, Lagos, you know, took a city of 15, 20 million people, you get phenomenal economic dynamism now happening. So that development revolution has happened. And you know, when I was taught development economics many years ago, it was all about the sheer hopelessness of Asia. You know, how would countries like India and Indonesia ever grow? You know, it was absolutely, nobody could imagine it, but it has happened. So that the development dimension has changed in unrecognizable but very positive ways. But the other side of your question is, well, do we need economic growth in rich economies like ours? Well, there has been a school of thought, much of it in the Green movement, which said in the boom years, well, you know, why do we want all this economic growth? Well, we've had 5 years without it. I don't get a sense that people are saying we've finally achieved nirvana, you know? Stagnation's great, let's have more of it. I mean, I may be missing something, but that's not the message I'm hearing. And of course, what happens in a stagnant economy, even in a rich country, which Britain still is that it makes the distributional issues much more acute. The gap between rich and poor is much more painfully apparent under conditions like we have at the moment. Because rich people are mobile, their capital is mobile, but poor people, workers, are having their real wages squeezed. This is a very traumatic period. And the idea that this is, you know, we've finally achieved happiness because we don't have any economic growth, I don't buy that at all. I think the one positive thing I would say about, you know, lying behind your question is that growth has to be sustainable. And that doesn't just mean economic sustainable, it has to be environmentally sustainable. And that's, you know, the whole debate around climate change is exactly about that. And if we are going to have sustainable economic growth and innovation, then that innovation has got to be directed more to having a green economy. Doesn't mean to say you don't have growth, but it means that the growth has to be directed in environmentally sustainable ways.